Then that morning he started talking about his car crash. He told me I said some things that had him thinking about it more and more. I don't know what I said, though.
Car crash! Car crash! Oh boy. So today's video is going to be fun because I'm going to be completely honest with you. There's really no way to go about this without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. While I do have a lot of evidence for today's theory, which I guess also sort of doubles as an analysis, I'll admit that some of it on its own just seems like I'm looking way too far into things. And maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But the thing about Infinity Train is that I always think that I'm overanalyzing things, and then it turns out in the end that I wasn't. So hopefully that's the case here. Otherwise, if we ever get a book 5 and I turn out to be completely and utterly wrong, this video is going to be very embarrassing in hindsight. So today, as is on brand for my channel, we're going to be talking about Amelia Hughes. Well, I guess that statement isn't entirely accurate. We're actually going to be talking about her fiance, Alrick Timmens. Though as there is literally only a few minutes of footage of him that actually exists, obviously his almost spouse is going to be part of the conversation as well. And I mean, she can't not be, considering their lives were wholly intertwined and his death literally led to the creation of the canon timeline that most of the show takes place in. I'll very briefly be talking about their relationship, though to be completely honest, you're probably better off watching the 2 videos that I made on them previously to get a better idea of what I'm referring to and the dynamic of their relationship. Shameless self-plug, but the Feminist Arc and Infinity Train video is actually one of my favorite videos that I've ever made, so I would suggest watching that one even if it weren't related to today's subject. So as I was saying, today's video is going to be focused on Alrick Timmens. Alrick was a young man in his mid to late 30s living in England with his fiancée and childhood friend, Amelia Hughes. They lived in the 1960s to the 1980s time period, both went to school for engineering, and seemed to live a quite secluded life where they depended on each other. Alrick seemed to be a very soft-spoken and anxious person based on the clips that we have seen him in, Amelia being the direct opposite, making them a match made in heaven, as she acted as a source of stability for him. And due to the time period, Alrick also enabled her to live a life that she wanted, since she had no way of doing so without a supportive man in her life. There was seemingly a type of codependency going on between the two, which is why when Alrick died, Amelia decided that she was better off dead than living and struggling without him. Of course, she didn't succeed in the venture to take her own life, as the train swooped in last minute and kidnapped her. Now we all know Amelia's story from this point onward. She spends 33 years trying to bring Alrick back to life after hijacking the train from 1-1, and is then later stopped by Tulip Olsen, who is on her own journey of self-discovery. A journey which just so happened to include the prior conductor, who she had found in her first car. You know the saying, one will often meet their destiny while trying to avoid it. So this is all fine and good so far, it's all canonical in terms of the timeline that we've been given in the show. But one piece of the puzzle is missing here. And that piece may seem insignificant, but it's actually incredibly important, as it was what spurred this entire show's events to happen in the first place. It really is a super dramatic case of the butterfly effect. And of course, I'm talking about Alrick's death. While we know that he did die, what we don't know is how. And while seemingly inconsequential to be that specific, I think that the way it happened and how it suddenly happened contributed to how horribly Amelia coped. So without further ado, let's get into the evidence.
There's a hole in the universe where Alrick used to be. Why won't the train just let me put him back?
I'm really sorry about your husband, Amelia. Neither of us can go back to the way things were. We have to adapt to the changes in our lives.
So before we begin, I'm going to mention this because I know it's going to be in the comments section if it isn't already. No, Alrick did not die in a dirt biking accident. Or at least, I don't think that he did. Listen, Owen Dennis likes to give these chaotic answers of death whenever somebody asks anything about a character, so it's not something that we should really take at face value. Like, if we were to take this answer seriously, it means that we also have to accept that the girl at the end of book 4 died from blood clots immediately after seeing Chicken Choice Judy, or that Hazel died horrifically in an Inside Out car, or, more tragically, that Tulip died in a boating accident after having got off the train. Suffice to say, I very highly doubt that Alrick actually died in a dirt biking accident, especially since, you know, NDA is very much a thing, and this was likely something that was going to be touched upon in Book 5. Although I will hand it to Owen, if he was telling the truth, this is a frogs with hats level of trolling and I salute him. But going off of the logical assumption that he isn't, we need to draw clues from the background details to find out what exactly happened. Thankfully, there is quite a bit. If you watch my How Does the Infinity Train Work video, you probably already know what some of these clues are. However, there are a few that I purposely didn't include, that way I could talk about them more in depth in this video. And also, I made that video before Book 4 released, so of course there's more evidence with that as well. So let's just get to the ones that I've already talked about out of the way. We know that Alrick died in a sudden accident based on a few things. The first is that in the unfinished car, you can see both a hospital bed and the IV in the background. They're sort of hard to spot, but I think that was intentional. We know that these are related to Amelia's memories, since literally everything else in that car is, even when in relation to the turtles and the architecture. The turtles are from the handkerchief that she wipes Alrick's forehead with in their graduation memory, and the architecture is from the old university campus that they both attended together. There's more comparisons that prove everything in this car stems from Amelia's memories, but you may want to watch the video that covers literally all of the ones that I could find first. Anyways, you're probably wondering, yeah, it's cool and all that there's a hospital bed and an IV, but how does this prove that an accident was to blame? After all, it was the 1980s, and healthcare was not advanced as it is now. And even if it were, people die from sickness all the time in modern day. And we know that the show is, or at least tries to be historically accurate, so who's to say he didn't die from some sort of illness over time? Well, here's where another piece of evidence points to this being an accident rather than some sort of illness. There's caution tape right before the exit of the car. And I'm sure that you already all know this, but it bears explanation as it's relevant to the point that I'm making here. Caution tape is commonly used to rope off dangerous areas, including accident scenes. Now, while it does make sense for there to be caution tape in the area of the car since there's no door there and it would be easy to fall out of, its inclusion in general is enough to add to this theory. As I mentioned earlier, everything in the unfinished car relates to Amelia's memories of Alrick. This is because she was trying to recreate him, so all of her memories with him were used in the car creation. It doesn't seem like any significant memories of any other relationships that she had were showcased in this car, at least none that are recognizable at this time. And one wouldn't have set this up as a safety measure, as this car was created and implemented far before he ever regained control, so it wasn't a safety measure taken by him as the conductor. And to be completely honest, safety isn't really a feature of the train. I mean, they literally have soul-sucking dog roaches that roam free. Do you really think that putting caution tape over a hazardous area on the train would be their top priority, even if 1-1 was the one in charge during its creation? Probably not, especially when he doesn't really seem too concerned if people die or fix their problems, since those seem to be the only two options. So it stands to reason that Amelia remembers caution tape in relation to Alrick, which is likely linked to the hospital equipment that we see in the background as well. So, in my opinion, this more or less confirms that our favorite sunshine feminist died tragically in some sort of accident. Though if you still weren't convinced at this point, there's also evidence that can be found in the background of the past car as well as the engine. Now, admittedly, they're both the same piece of evidence, but the way in which they're presented is significant. So in the background of the past car, it's seen that Amelia is holding up a phone to her ear with a shocked expression on her face. It also seems like it's rather dark out, which will be important to remember for later in this video. Now, this alone is enough to imply that this is when she heard about Alrick's accident, but we know for a fact that it likely was due to this image's reappearance in the engine. When Tulip throws the TV at Amelia that is playing her memory tape, the images previously seen in the past car flash by in chronological order. And which is the last image that we see before it cuts back to Tulip? The image of her on the phone. This heavily implies that this was the last memory in her recording before the funeral and train boarding memories that Tulip actually explores occur. So this more or less cements the fact that yes, Alrick did die in some sort of accident. While not telling us directly, it was set up in such a way to leave breadcrumbs for when they finally did make that reveal. Renew Infinity Train. Alright, so now it's time to get more specific. We know that he died in some sort of accident, but what type of accident was it? Was it work-related? We know that both he and Amelia worked in engineering, which, yeah, can be a very dangerous job when you're working on machines all day, every day. Okay, so what other type of accidents could he possibly have had? A dirt biking accident? We've already been over that one. No. While there's tons of accidents that he could have theoretically been involved in, I think the one that is most likely, and the only one which the evidence I'm about to go over points to, is that Alrick died from being in a car accident. Not only is this the 5th most leading cause of death, but there's just so much pointing to this being the case. Now, I'm going to start with the obvious, which I also briefly went over in one of my previous videos. In the episode The Engine, Amelia is mid-creating a new car when she's intercepted by a very angry Tulip who is trying to fix a gommed-up Atticus. Now, this new car looks a lot like the unfinished car and shares a lot of the same background details, it's just more put together and with some minor changes. There's still turtles and jam though, further proving the point about her memories with him being where these elements originated from. And on that note, one thing that this car includes that the other one didn't is cars. Like the vehicle, not like train cars. Now, this is where it starts getting interesting. In this new car that Amelia is creating, there are 2 vehicles that we can see. One of them is easy to find, the other is just chilling in the sky. Anyways, the point is that there's 2 cars that can be seen here. One is that red car that I just mentioned, the other is a green car that is flipped upside down that Tulip hides behind to protect herself from a very angry pipe-wielding geriatric. And as I mentioned previously, everything in these cars relate to Amelia's memories regarding Alrick. And matching up with that statement, both of the cars look very similar in build to a 1980s Buick, which was one of the most popular cars during that time period. Now, the flipped over car is significant, not only because it's the one that Tulip hides behind and therefore is in plain view, but also because of its color. Now, maybe only Ryman fans will get the significance of that statement without explanation, but essentially green and burgundy are the Book 1 equivalent of Ryan and Min's blue and red from Book 4. Basically, what I'm saying here is that the color green is always associated with Alrick, and it's also the color of turtles, which is very heavily linked to him in the context of Amelia's memories. And as you could guess by process of elimination, burgundy is the color most heavily associated with Amelia, and later was also more or less the same color as the sine wave of her mecha suit. It's funny how things distort as time marches onwards, huh? So not only was the inclusion of cars interesting, but the position of them as well causes you to raise an eyebrow for sure. Alright, so this is where we're getting to possibly the most interesting evidence that I have. This is actually the first time I'm talking analytically about Book 4 on this channel, so I'm pretty excited to go over it. So in Book 4 of Infinity Train, while running from a bunch of denizens that Kez has wronged, Mingi, Ryan, and Kez come across a sentient castle by the name of Morgan. Now, Morgan and Kez were originally friends and roommates before there was an accident with Morgan's passenger companion, Jeremy. Essentially, Kez helped Jeremy work through his problems, he left the train by accident when his number hit 0, and Morgan didn't like that. I do want to talk about this whole episode and situation more in the future because there is a lot to unpack with the symbolism and overall foreshadowing that this scene holds for Book 5, however, it's not incredibly relevant at the moment. What's important here is the reason Jeremy boarded the train, and the reason he was on in the first place is because he was involved in a fatal car accident that killed his mother and sister, and he was the one who was driving and lived. I'm sure that you can see where I'm going with this already, but just listen. When explaining the car accident, Kez explains how it was foggy out and Jeremy got into the accident because the other driver couldn't see them. It's mentioned that Jeremy's mother and sister did die, but the state of the other driver is never explicitly mentioned. It could be deduced that it's likely the other driver didn't escape unscathed either, as it was a situation where they were both driving at each other head-on with low visibility. If they both swerved or collided, it's possible that both cars and their inhabitants didn't escape uninjured. If it was bad enough to kill 2 people, who says it wasn't bad enough to kill 3? Going back to the image of Amelia on the phone as well that we've all pretty much assumed at this point is her just hearing of the news, it's dark outside. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that this happened in the nighttime, though that is a possible source for the darkness. It's also possible that it was a cloudy and/or rainy day with a lot of fog. And if you've ever driven in super thick fog before, you would know just how difficult it is to see and how dark it can make everything. Honestly, in my opinion, it's much harder to drive in fog than it is to drive just in regular night darkness. All in all, it matches up pretty well. Jeremy also mentions a trilby in his diary, which was actually a type of hat that was favored by upper-class British men and was most commonly worn during horse races. So we even have a hint at the fact that Jeremy possibly could have been from Great Britain, putting him and Alrick in at least the same geographical area to make this possible. Now, speaking more on the contents of the diary, because there is a possible discrepancy here that people have pointed out to me before when we've discussed this theory in the past. Jeremy mentions that he's been stuck on the train for 5 years, which understandably causes Ryan to freak out a bit. It's been discussed that this timetable wouldn't actually make a whole lick of sense, considering Amelia's takeover of the train happens after Jeremy leaves, implying that the accident Jeremy was in is completely unrelated to how Alrick died. And while I could see this being the case, I don't think that this actually disproves anything. One mistake that I made in my previous videos talking about the general situation is that I sometimes referred to Alrick as Amelia's husband, when the fact is, they never actually got to get married. We know this in a few ways, but the main one is the last name. While it is possible Amelia would have wanted to keep her last name, standards of that time period would suggest that her name would have been Amelia Timmens if she had gotten married. The fact that it isn't raises our first red flag. She also lacks a wedding ring, and we didn't see any memory of her wedding in the tape with all of her other memories. I would imagine that if they had gotten married, that would be one of the memories present. And when talking about what Book 5 could have been, the language used by Owen is exclusively fiance and not husband when he's referring to the late blonde. So if they hadn't gotten married before Alrick died, it likely means that Amelia was on the train for a little bit longer than was originally estimated. She was in control of the train for 33 years, but that's not to say she was on the train for 33 years. We know that Amelia boarded the train sometime in the mid to late 1980s, but there was a bit of a large and unaccounted for gap between the time Amelia proposed and her actual boarding. So that gap could be explained if she actually boarded 5 years earlier than was originally estimated previously. And thinking more on it, it didn't really seem like Jeremy had left Morgan and Kez all that long before Book 4 had occurred. The wounds of that situation seemed relatively fresh, and Kez wasn't really even that far away from her car if you think about it. And to be honest, I don't really think that spending 5 years on the train before meeting 1-1, or rather 1 at that point in time, is that big of a performance in mental gymnastics. Amelia was in a state where it would take her multiple years to process her grief, even without having been in control of the train and on a power trip. And that's honestly understandable, as she was literally willing to end her own life rather than actually do that. You could easily spend 5 years exploring the train and learning about how it worked before coincidentally running into the conductor. It doesn't seem like it's a very common occurrence, so in short, I don't feel like the time gap disproves anything. If anything, I feel it probably makes a tad more sense, because Amelia just boarding the train and automatically getting into a position of influence and taking over seems less likely. And to be honest, even if Jeremy wasn't a part of the accident that killed Alrick, I still think his cause of death had to have been a car accident. And to round off what I was talking about earlier, I often think that losing people suddenly and tragically, like in the case of an accident when they're young and healthy, is worse than knowing that they're going to die and waiting for it. Being real for a second, it's really messed up to think about how she probably woke up that morning, kissed him goodbye, and then never saw him again when she was expecting him to be back home. Suddenly, she had everything ripped out from under her. There was no preparing her for it. She was just shoved into a deep end of raging rapids without a life jacket. And I honestly feel that that was a contributing factor to how bad her reaction to his death was. I'm not saying that she would have handled it well if it was something slow like a sickness that took him, but at the very least, they would have gotten time to process what was happening. And in addition, if you've ever had to deal with helping to organize a funeral, you know that there really isn't any time to grieve or process what happened until after the ceremony is done. As his fiancée, I highly doubt that she had much time to process what had happened at all, since she was probably expected to be involved in that process that was very suddenly thrust upon her. It's just a messed up situation, and given her background, yeah, I could see why she was driven to the point that she was and reacted as poorly as she did. The unfortunate thing is that we're never going to find out if this theory is true or how Alrick actually died since, you know, the show was cancelled. Though I guess if nothing else, that's a reason to help push for renewal. The Infinity Train fandom on Twitter organizes trend events every few months, and we've been incredibly successful the past few runs. Hell, it even helps to just theorize and talk about the show on social media. And if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon to be notified of when I upload. Special thank you to my top tier patrons: Ambrose Rothwood, Jeffy Games, Brandon Nunes, The Lovely Ghosty, Sadin Suzuki, Lee Taylor, and Zachary Ansley. Because of people like them, I can continue to make content like this. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Have an amazing day, guys.